Hey, Angel. Thanks
Hey, how
for
are you?
joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah. Let's dive into this conversation about race and racism and related topics to that. I'll just share some intentions for our conversation today. Then we can each share a little bit about ourselves, and then we can dive in. Angel, I'll just say, is someone that I reached out to recently because I've seen him online. One of the good things about social media is you can actually find really interesting, intelligent, thoughtful people who you wouldn't otherwise have found. And I've read some of Angel's articles and seen that he works for an organization called FAIR, the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. And I've just been impressed with his thinking. Overall, I thought he'd be a good dialogue partner. And this topic of race and racism is something I've thought a lot about in my life and continue to think a lot about. And just really wanted to have a conversation where we can see if we can come to a shared understanding about some of the things that are going on in the world today, about some of the things that are really most important to understand about this topic of race and racism, and see if we can highlight some things that would be helpful to others in terms of how do we really move through and heal and progress and just move forward as a people, as a culture, and as individuals.
Mhm.
On this beautiful earth together. So I'll share a little bit about myself, Angel, just for context, and then I'll pass the mic to you. You can share a little bit about yourself, and then
Sure,
we'll dive in.
sure.
So we don't know each other well, so also just so you can get to know me a little bit, I'm someone for whom this topic has really been central in my life, my entire life, in some ways, because I grew up on the east side of Cleveland, Ohio, in a community that was mostly Black. So most of my friends and classmates in community were Black Americans growing up, and that was just a part of my life.
Mhm,
Really grew up in the hip hop culture of the 80s and 90s.
mhm,
Just happened to mostly date women of color and Black women. I've happened to have married a Black woman, and now that's a big part of my family. You know, her parents actually both grew up in Harlem and the Bronx in the 50s and 60s. So getting to know them and that whole side of what is now my family and that sort of New York Black American experience, which you might know a little something about though later in time.
mhm.
So that's just been a part of my life. It's something I've really been steeped in and I've really been reflecting on. And what's been interesting for me is, you know, I feel like that was a great actually privilege for me to grow up in a very diverse environment and one where actually my racialization was the minority in that context. I've
Mhm.
always actually from a really young age felt like that was a real advantage for me and I felt blessed in that way. But one of the things that's interesting for me now is seeing how the conversation is changing, right? And a lot has changed, I feel like, in the field of the diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm also an educator, so I've been working in progressive schools for the last, 15, 20 years or so, and seeing how that conversation is changing in schools. And now I'm
Mhm.
a school leader, and I'm sort of feeling the responsibility to help have meaningful conversations and social show some leadership on this issue for my school community. So me reaching out to people like you is part of my effort to do that, really wanting to in some sense model inquiry and conversation, but also in terms of content, really wanting to be in some sense educational and sharing our learning with others.
Mhm.
So hoping that I can learn from you today and maybe even vice versa. So
Awesome.
that's kind of where I'm coming from. Maybe you can say a little bit about how you found yourself doing this work.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think we're engaged in a very similar projects.
Mm,
Um, yeah, my upbringing, my parents are Dominican immigrants. They came here in the early to mid 1980s. I was born in the mid 80s. I mainly grew up here in New York City and in a suburb in New Jersey, just jumping back and forth all the time. And it's interesting because so much of my perspective, I think, is informed by that experience of living in New York City and then living in a suburb of New York City where, you could walk into Manhattan in 20 minutes, right? So it's not far. It's very barely a suburb, right? It's just over the George Washington Bridge. It's Fort Lee, New Jersey. That's where I grew up mainly. And it was an extremely ethnically and culturally diverse area, um, as New York is, right? But But my experience in New York City, though, was being surrounded by Spanish speaking people. I mainly lived in Washington Heights, which, as now I think everybody knows, thanks to Lin-Manuel Miranda, is chock full of Dominicans and Puerto Ricans and a few other stragglers from other, some Cubans and then some South and Central Americans, but mainly it's Dominicans. And then there's a little bit of Puerto Rican in there too. And so, we're talking about, they have their own taxi cabs, right? There's no yellow cabs in the Heights. It's black Lincoln Town cars with little Dominican flag decals on them, right? All the businesses are owned and operated by Spanish speaking people, mostly Dominican, and all the patrons are mostly Dominican, Spanish speaking people. So I was surrounded by people who spoke Spanish, and that was the world I lived in. And it didn't even occur to me that other people even existed, right? I had no concept of that. I went to a Catholic school where there were some other kids from other areas funneling in, but it was such a small proportion in comparison that I still didn't really think about it, right? And so I had a bit of a culture shock when I moved to New Jersey, into this suburb, and all of a sudden it's 70% Korean. And there are kids from all over the place, right? Their parents emigrated here from Nigeria and Egypt and, the Philippines and Japan and obviously Korea. And there were a ton of Jewish kids as well, right? And they're from all over, right? So we just kind of lump them in as Jewish kids, but they're from all over the place. Um, and so that was just really interesting to me to go, oh, okay, so you guys do it like this, and then you guys do this at home, and this is the language you speak, and these are the kind of foods that you eat. And that already started to open my eyes a little bit. But a critical aspect to my upbringing is that race in that way never played a part in the way that we saw ourselves or one another. Race was very much something that we read about in books and that we understood as being part of our American past, as this thing that was thought of in a very wrong way, and a thing that was used in a very terrible way against people, right? So we read all about, and we learned all about the Holocaust, and we read all about and learned all about, slavery and the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, and all those things, as you do. And my conception of it was very much that this is something really stupid that people did to each other, and it was terrible. And it didn't even occur to me or anybody else, apparently, in my cohort, to bring that back or to use it or to internalize it or to any of that. It seemed very much relegated to that sort of, this is in the dustbin where it belongs kind of thing. We saw each other's differences, of course, oh, you're from Egypt, you're from Nigeria, you're from whatever. But it didn't really matter in any fundamental way, right? The thing, kids were still mean to each other and stuff, but they were mean to each other because this kid sucks at sports or because this kid's awkward or whatever. The usual stuff. The race stuff had nothing to do with it. And then it's shifted a little bit in middle school once we hit 7th, 8th grade, because people started kind of trying to look for their cliques, and they're trying to figure themselves out and find themselves. And one of the easiest sort of packages on offer is, well, if you belong to this ethnic group, then there's a prepackaged sort of way to be, music to listen to, stuff to do, stuff to like, stuff to not like, people to not like, all that kind of stuff. It was an equivalent option to like being a jock or being a goth or whatever, right? Or skater kid or whatever. It kind of looked that way to me, at least. And I tried to hang with the Spanish kids, which is what we called that whole group, right? Which is also kind of reductive, but we were the Spanish kids, right? Puerto Rican, Dominican, Cuban, whatever. But I didn't fit in. It didn't work because they were, generally speaking, they all seemed to get along in a way, and they all kind of had things in common that I didn't have with them. I listened to different music, right? I was listening to Led Zeppelin and Queen and that sort of stuff. They were listening to, the late 90s hip hop and that kind of thing. And it was completely alien to me. they had different kind of sense of humor, different style of dress. And, you know, the way that I speak kind of set me apart as well, because they had more of like a hip hop type vernacular. And just me saying hip hop type vernacular would have already, you know, stuck
Mhm.
me out. So you can tell.
Yeah.
And so that forced me out, right? I couldn't successfully assimilate into the group that I belonged to, supposedly,
Mhm.
despite all the concrete things that I had in common with them. You know, we ate the same food at home. Our grandmas are the same. Like, I know exactly what you're talking about when you talk about ABC. That
Mhm.
didn't matter, right? Because personality wise, it didn't work. And so that forced me into this outside in scenario where I had to kind of scramble to figure myself out and just become comfortable with myself over the next like 10, 15 years from
Mhm.
that point on. Right. And it was very difficult and it was a struggle, but eventually I came to this point where I'm like, all right, well, you know, I'm just this guy. And, you know, I don't think of myself as Dominican really. I am Dominican. There's much about it that I connect with and I love, but I don't really see myself that way. And I definitely don't see myself in a racialized way.
Mhm.
In
Mhm.
grad school, um, which was, you know, 2014, 2016,
Mhm.
that's when things started to blow up. And I'm like, whoa, this is crazy, right? All this
Mhm.
intensity. I'm like, why are people like putting themselves in these boxes? And it became very strange to me as having been an outsider for so long, you know, having been someone for whom those things didn't work at all. It was very strange to watch people kind of contort themselves into these things. And I
Mhm.
realized how limiting all that stuff is, and how pernicious it can be and how divisive it really is.
Mhm.
And I know I've been going for a bit, but uh, the biggest shift since then is, you know, around 2019, 2020, I really started to think and read and learn more about race itself.
Mhm.
And I have become, you know, progressively since then, a race atheist. And
Mhm.
by which I mean, I don't think race exists in any form. I don't, you know, I agree with someone like Dr. Sheena Mason in that race is not real either biologically, nor is it a construction. So when people say race is a construct, I don't even think it is a construct. I think even that's an illusion. And I'm very much with the project of abandoning race entirely and removing ourselves from that sort of
Mhm.
boxing in and all of that stuff. So that informs so much of what I do and so much of what I
Mhm.
talk about with respect to these
Mhm.
particular issues.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. No, that's really rich and illustrative. And what it brings up for me is just this sense of we all have this arc of growth as
Mm-hmm.
individuals and a journey that we're on. And I think for both of us, there's this very embodied and experiential journey that we've been on. And we've actually been fortunate to have had a fairly rich and broad exposure in our
Right.
lives. I think that
Right.
that has had a big influence on us.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there's also a way in which, you know, you can kind of see through, like through that embodied personal journey, you can come to sort of common sense obvious conclusions or places about, you know, how we should relate to each other,
Right.
and that are sort of intuitively non-racialized, right, but also very cultural, uh very
Mm-hmm.
cultural and very culturally rich, you know, like you gave examples of sort of different subcultures that you were exposed to. And for
Mm-hmm.
me too, it was a little bit less diverse in the sense it was actually very strongly like Black American hip hop culture is mostly what I
Mm-hmm.
grew up in. And then when I went to college, I actually had an interesting kind of culture shock because I'm from Cleveland Heights, Ohio, mostly Black community, to Kent State, Kent, Ohio, which is very rural and very white. And I hated it, actually. I did not vibe with like white rural culture. I didn't fit in. I didn't want to belong to that. And it actually was a process and journey for me to sort of integrate that in a way, to realize like I didn't have to be averse to that. I didn't have to have a persona that was like hip hop Brad necessarily. I could grow beyond that in a little bit. And we all have our own journey with like,
Yeah.
there's an adolescentness to that journey too. But as you become an adult, ideally you move beyond some of that groupishness, you know, that I think both of us experience. And you learn how to integrate more and be more
Mhm.
holistic and more
Right.
open-minded, and more fluid
Yeah.
too. So I
Yeah.
think we have very similar journeys. So it's interesting to hear yours and reflect on mine. And
Yeah.
it's also then it lands us in a place where we each two and especially these past 5-6 years, I've also just been doing a lot of reading and a lot of trying to get a sense of what's going on in the world and the zeitgeist, and especially since Trump got elected and the reaction to that. And even prior to that, Obama getting elected and then the reaction to that, there was clearly a very racialized aspect to the Obama presidency, and there was a very racialized quality to the whole Trump presidency. So we have been living in intensely racialized times, and obviously looking back, this country has been intensely racialized. And in some ways, we've been really lucky to be in kind of experiential bubbles where we were sheltered maybe from the most pernicious forms of that and exposed to some of the beauties. So as we're sort of now adults trying to figure out what's going on, I'm wondering if we can think together about, you know, there's these very, like, I actually want to hear more about this understanding of race, you know, not even as a construction, because I guess one of the ways I think about it is there's a lot of confusion around what that even means, that it being a construction. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is, well, how do we just acknowledge the layers to the reality of race, right? Like if racism has a reality, right, and racism produces an ideology of race, which is what a lot of people are sort of learning as they look back on history and see how race was constructed. And if that's fundamentally based on a false idea, like there is no biological race, but racism is real and has real effects. And that's sort of what a lot of people with the megaphones, I think, are really wanting us to acknowledge and affirm, like, let's not forget how real racism is. So those sort of, you know, the social relations that are formed through racism sort of have an effect on people, and also sort of impacts people's identities and sense of their self, right? And people start to associate those categories with their experience, and just kind of makes it hard to get out of. Like I feel like it's hard to let go of a racial ideology because it shapes people's identity, and because we're sort of activated through the racial injuries that sort of constitute our identity. So I'm trying to unpack, like, yes, race, you know, people saying it's a construct is a way for people to help them acknowledge that it's not biological and it doesn't have a layer of reality, but to include the reality of racism in the sort of way that people have related to each other based on this fiction. So can you say more about what you mean that it's not even a construct? Do you just mean that you don't feel like it's necessary? We don't have to keep reinforcing it and reifying it? Or do you mean something even stronger than that?
I would say it begins there. So, you know, this is probably the most recent switch that was flipped in my head, right? So I may even be incapable of quite articulating it well. I feel like I've got it, but I'm not totally sure. And this is from engaging with Sheena Mason, whom I recommend everyone check out if they haven't already. So, you know, her thing and my thing now is that race, you know, what people say is race is not biological, right? There are many philosophies of race, right? There some people say, no, it's biological. You know, there are genetic differences between these different groups of human that merit the categories, right? I reject that. I think human genetic diversity is way more complex than that. And the crude racialized groups that we've become accustomed to do a horrific job of grafting onto that diversity, right? So just to put a pin on that, or just to close that door there is more genetic diversity within the continent of Africa, you know, the vast majority of whose population we would racialize as Black, than the rest of the world combined, right? So if it's about genetics, then there must be dozens, maybe hundreds of races within the continent of Africa, and they all look like Black people, quote unquote, right? So that obviously that metric doesn't work. That categorization, that taxonomy doesn't work. But what most people say is that race is a social construct, and by which they mean that it's an idea that we operate under, right? It's an idea the same way that, you know, money is not real. We just make it up. We decide how much value $10 versus $20 is, and we just operate under those constructs, right? But what I realized, and what Sheena has helped me realize, is that there's a fundamental difference between a construct like money and a supposed construct like race. Now, race is an idea, but for it to be a construct, it actually would have to have some kind of substance that it actually doesn't have in any kind of conceivable way. And what I mean is, when we talk about money, right? When we use money as a system upon which we build value and credit and all those things, those systems reduce to money, right? To the concept of money, that construct of money. And when we talk about money, like, oh, I'm going to give you 20 bucks. And, what we're talking about is the thing, is money itself, that idea, that construct. But when we're talking about race, what's actually happening is we're talking about culture, or we are talking about ethnicity, or we're talking about ancestry, or we're talking about skin color, or we're talking about some kind of genetic subpopulation. And we don't realize it because we're putting all of that underneath the label of race, right? So it's actually, race can be broken down and reduced to these more fundamental concepts that are as strong as the concept of money, right? So ethnicity is something that we made up, right? There's no kind of objective ethnicity in that way, right? The border lines that we draw on land don't exist. We've just created them and we adhere to them. So those are constructs. Race is something that we put on top of that construct that actually blurs it and hides it. And so part of, the project that you mentioned of, people wanting, first of all, to acknowledge racism, which is a very real thing. And in no way am I dismissing or disregarding it. But then we have this other thing of race, and the reason why so many people are hesitant to abandon it is because in their understanding, getting rid of something like race would be to get rid of ethnicity and culture and ancestry and community and all of those wonderful things. And the project that we have to figure out how to successfully engage in is just showing people that that's not the case, that the only thing that would go away is this idea that actually poisons culture and community and ethnicity and ancestry. It poisons it, it spoils it, it ruins it. It makes it less fruitful, less beautiful, less intense, less able to be connected to, because it's this pernicious kind of, just skin that we put over it, to be, to pardon the pun, but like, that's really what's going on there. So that's the difference. Does that make sense in terms of?
I think it's almost like it's not a construct in the sense that it's almost a meta construct. Like you said, it's already on top of, like, culture is an abstraction to something. Like, there's the reality of people and the things that they do, and the language and the behaviors and the rituals, and then we can sort of abstract from that and call it culture. Or we can think about the culture of a particular group of people from a particular place and abstract that and call it ethnicity or something. But it's like, those are already construction abstractions from just embodied lived reality.
Exactly.
So basically, it's the realization that you can take away the concept of race and not lose anything.
Yeah. In fact, you have so much to gain, because you realize, oh, my culture has nothing to do with my skin color. Just like you, right? Your culture was 80s, 90s hip hop culture, right? And that's not racialized, right? If it really were racialized, there would be some fundamental way in which you wouldn't be able to understand it or participate in it or experience it, right? But that's not true. You experienced it. It was part of you, it was your core, because you grew up there.
Seeing that, not allowing ourselves to be overly reductive in any way. Like, really, like, my culture, when I think about my culture growing up, it was a combination of my family, right? And their roots, like some Dutch and Austrian roots, their upbringing in, like, urban Philadelphia and urban Cleveland and Chicago, like, their family cultures influenced my family culture. And where I grew up, my neighborhood is part of my culture, and 90s hip hop, and just like pop American culture of my childhood, and like mass media that I was exposed to. Like, all of that is layered into what my embodied culture is, and each individual has a different layered of that. And actually, nowhere in that, in no meaningful way is whiteness a necessary or helpful construct in even me
Yep.
understanding my experience, except for that, you know, I do think that there's a layer where, you know, some people would point to where,
Mhm.
because the concept of whiteness and the category of whiteness has been created, like whiteness
Uh-huh.
and blackness are concepts that have been well established, and they
Mhm.
have been associated with certain qualities, whether, you know, as tragically as that is,
Yeah.
you know, people would speak to, there are potentially aspects of white privilege that I did experience in my life that could still be seen as part of my experience and part of my, I
Right.
don't know if we call it part of my culture, but definitely part of my experience. Part of the social world that I lived in is a
Sure.
world where these categories are present in the mental worlds of
Mhm.
beings, you know,
Mhm.
sort
Yeah,
of like
yeah.
how we're reckoning with that is, it's really, really the
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah, yeah. So this is,
Yeah.
I think it's a very good idea to reiterate as much as possible that we're not pretending reality is not what it
Mhm.
is.
Yeah.
There's just a conscious choice to engage with reality in a particular way.
Mhm.
And that's the important bit, right? It's not, the analogy I always draw is I'm someone, I was raised Catholic, but I don't believe in God. I'm not a religious person, right? So that makes me an atheist. That doesn't mean that I don't recognize that other people are not atheists, that other
Mhm.
people are very, very devout in their
Mhm.
religious faith, that there are multiple religious faiths, and that I live in a world formed by religious faith, right?
Mhm.
Our human history is one where the vast majority of people were believers. And in many important ways, history was shaped specifically by these specific beliefs, right?
Mhm.
Our holidays and our,
Mhm.
uh, a lot of our norms that have become secular
Mhm.
originated in some form of religious faith, right? A lot of those things. So I recognize all that stuff, and I recognize that some people are still religious today, and they're going to behave according to those religious beliefs, right? So it's important for me to understand what the precepts are, what the tenets are, so that I can understand why people are behaving the way they are. But at
Mhm.
no point do I have to buy into it myself. I don't have to believe what they believe, and I don't
Mhm.
have to behave in a way that reinforces the beliefs that they believe that I don't. Right. So it's the same
Yeah.
thing. I
Yeah.
recognize, first of all, racism exists because that is behavior based on the belief in race. I don't share that belief, but I see the behavior and I have to deal with it, right? Personally, and also just as a member of society. So there's that.
Mhm.
But also, we have to recognize how limiting these concepts really are, right? So you mentioned whiteness and blackness.
Mhm.
And there's this idea that, just to narrow it down to hip hop culture, right?
Mhm.
That is a black thing. Hip hop culture is a black thing.
Mhm.
Blackness is all over it, right? And
Mhm.
you as a white person, there's some way in which
Mhm.
you may not enter, and
Mhm.
you could not enter even if you tried, right? There's some way in which you couldn't relate and you couldn't connect to it. I think that's clearly false.
Mhm.
But even beyond that, what does it mean for it to be black, right? What does it mean for that particular genre of music to be a black genre of music, right? Because what you have is, you know, you said Cleveland, right? That's where you grew up.
Yeah.
You have Cleveland, right? You have, let's say, like the Detroit hip hop scene, and then you have the New York hip hop scene, and then you have
Mhm.
the LA hip hop scene, right?
Mhm.
Those
Yeah.
are very different.
Those are all
Imagine
different
lumping all
cultures.
of those together, right?
Yeah.
Imagine a hip hop fan being told, "Oh, that's all just the same hip hop," and you're like, "Whoa, no way!"
Yeah.
Right?
And you
No
could
way.
definitely see tribalism within that. Like I was an East Coast hip hop person and was kind of a hater on West Coast hip hop.
There
You
you
know,
go. Yeah,
there's always tribalism elements present in
exactly.
subcultures, and that's that
Right.
human quality to it. Yeah.
But it's the essentialism of thinking, no, this is a black thing.
Mhm.
People kind of frame that in a way of, you know, that it's a point of pride, right? Like this belongs to me. And I
Mhm.
get that. But
Mhm.
it's weird because what you're also doing is saying those other things don't belong to me. And
Yeah.
those other things are always there's always going to be more of the other things than whatever your thing is, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why I think it was so powerful when Glenn Lowry gave this speech a few months ago where, you know, he was talking about essentialism, and he was talking about this sort of thing. And he just made these declarative statements. He said, Tolstoy is mine. Shakespeare is mine. That belongs to me. How dare you try to take it away from me? I think
Yeah.
everyone should feel that way. You know, it's
Yeah.
a human thing. It belongs to everybody.
Yeah, no, it's so important. And it really, to me, it just seems like an important nuancing and just getting more careful and descriptive with our language and just not oversimplifying in these categories of like people of
Mhm.
color and black and white. They're just such radical oversimplifications
Yeah.
that so much gets lost.
Mhm.
And it doesn't seem what I guess what seems weird about it is it doesn't seem that weird to just acknowledge the things that we're acknowledging and include them in our understanding, and to help these sort of nuances and distinctions help inform our appreciation of social reality.
Mhm.
And I guess one of the ironies for me in witnessing socially over the last few years is that as this notion of race as a social construct almost has become more mainstream,
Mhm.
it seems like it's ironically become more reified. You know, it's I feel like
Yeah.
as people are bringing attention to the history of race and racism and how really even like, you know, the concept of whiteness did not exist in the 15th and 16th centuries. It came on
Mhm.
later, and there's a specific history to that that's specific to slavery, and sort of it's very economic and political, obviously.
Yeah.
And I would think that the more we would learn about that history, the more we would learn about how these things were constructed, the more we would be able to liberate ourselves from them, and that there would be more and more
Mm.
people sort of just naturally impelled toward thinking of things the way that like you and Sheena and others are thinking of them, because there is this liberational quality to it. It's like you as an
Yeah.
individual can be free of these
Mhm.
abstractions, and we don't have to reduce ourselves to them. What's your
Mhm.
sense of like why is it so hard for people to make that move? Why are people so either unable or uninterested or unwilling to actually make that kind of
Yeah.
declaration and sort of let go of some of these identifications?
I think it's probably a mix of many things. I was thinking about this the other day. I was at a conference with Carlos Hoyt and Sheena Mason and Greg Thomas where we were talking about this stuff.
Mhm.
And I made the comments that, you know, I am what is called, or what I call, a daywalker, right? It's a Blade reference, but it's basically a vampire who can walk in the daylight, right? So now you can live in these two different worlds. I was able to occupy many worlds because I didn't quite fit into any of them, right? And I think you feel similarly, right? And the funny thing about all this stuff is that if we screenshotted this chat and we pasted it somewhere and said, okay, one of these two people grew up steeped in hip hop culture,
Mhm.
um, and you know, dated almost exclusively within the African American population, and
Mhm.
um, and most of the friend group was in that sort of cohort as well. Meanwhile, the other person lived in an incredibly mixed area, listened to 1970s rock music, et cetera, right? You see where I'm
Yeah,
going. They would
yeah,
pick the wrong people.
yeah.
And the reason they would pick the wrong people for those details is because of race, is because of an adherence to an essentialism that concept brings
Mhm.
inevitably. And both of us would be erased. Our unique individuality would be erased by these things. Now, the reason why, so what I asked at the conference was, I think that having been somebody who didn't quite fit, who couldn't successfully glob myself onto or dissolve myself into those particular groups, I was forced to see things a different way. And I had a feeling that everyone who was at that conference had a similar experience, right? As you and I, where
Mhm.
you know what it's like because you're technically not in the world you belong,
Mhm.
right? Because of these silly things. And then it makes you realize, oh, these things are silly. Because how can somebody tell me that I don't love this music just
Mhm.
because of my skin? That's insane. Right.
Mhm.
So, but I think one of the reasons why we seem to be snakes eating our own tails is because um of that, because of a successful kind of in group like adherence and assimilation, right? We become this thing. We're fighting it. We say that it's a construct. You know, we say that it was imposed upon us. which is also a weird thing to say, right? But we would say that it was imposed upon our group by an outside group, and that we live in this society and we're forced into this paradigm. And then we say, well, you know what? I'm going to create a community and a culture around it. And I'm going to then become very proud of it. And I'm going to become very protective of it. That's one of the reasons, right? Now it's really difficult to let go because we have conflated it with culture and community and ethnicity and all these things. And the other reason is the language we use, and the way that we conceptualize these things. So we say race is a social construct, but the way that we speak and think and act with respect to these topics isn't like it's a social construct. It's like it's a real, concrete, inescapable thing. You know, you, Brad, you are white, and your whiteness cannot be escaped. And you're just going to have to deal with the fact that you are fundamentally poisoned with this thing that had nothing to do with you. You didn't make it up. You didn't ask for it. It just is what it is. Right. I think so much of our language, so much of our rhetoric, so much of our thinking is geared in that way. And that makes it impossible to escape. Right. We put ourselves in this circular maze with no exit.
Yeah.
You know, we're just kind of running around, but we're not going to do anything until we actively reject this paradigm. You know, we can see it, but we don't have to play ball. It's a kind of fish don't know they're wet thing.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, there's so many layers to it, and it really does seem to me like a developmental journey of sorts. And the more we can sort of trace that out for people, the more we can at least aspire to sort of move through these stages of realization of how to understand what constructs are. I mean, there's, to me too, there's really deep layers of our humanity and our collective psyche that do have to do with in-group, out-group dynamics, us versus them dynamics. Scapegoating is a really deep part of human history. You know, there's a thinker named Rene Girard who I've been reading, who's been getting kind of popular because it's so relevant, because it's really digging into the anthropology and archaeology of tribalism and scapegoating, and the way like human sacrifice, how prevalent human sacrifice has been throughout history, how prevalent slavery has been throughout history. These really deep dynamics of us versus them, in group, out group, and the subjugation of other people is a big part of our collective humanity. And these sort of dynamics are still coming to the fore, I think, in these new 21st century contexts. And I feel like the more we can universalize that, like see that as not belonging to or reductive to any particular group of people, you know, like, and really taking that more universal view of all of humanity, and every culture has to manage these kinds of dynamic one way or the other. But all the more reason to create aspirational norms and ideals that are inclusive and that are more up to the task of actually creating a healthy culture for the 21st century, which in some ways too, I think we just have to name, we're in this kind of unprecedented moment. I mean, which is always the case because history is just unfolding, right? And we can't go back. So we have these really deep psychological and sociological patterns that we're still playing out just like our ancestors did, but in a totally different context, right? And even, you know, which actually brings me to something that I want to bring into the conversation, which is just the novelty of social media and the way in which our sort of media ecology right now is exacerbating some of the polarization that's happening in society. And it's like, it's one thing for you and I to have embodied lives where we're exposed to lots of different people and subcultures, and we can experience the beauty and the goodness of that. But it's just the way that that's mediated, and the way that there's a sort of neo-tribalism or mimetic tribalism that's happening online. It's like these deep psychological drives of us versus them dynamics and like group belonging needs are like taking shape in a digital space with a sort of digital tribalism. It's just creating this really unhealthy combination. And I think one of our big questions is, how do we get out of that and really be in our embodied reality more, and find ways to have that sense of belonging and group identity and sort of tribal identity to whatever degree that's developmentally and psychologically needed? How do we integrate that without becoming sort of racialized or way too oversimplified?
It's hard. It's hard. Well, first of all, the genie's not going back in the bottle. Right? The internet's here to stay, and it's going to become more and more a part of our lives. I don't think it's going to go backwards. I don't think we're going to
Yeah.
suddenly go analog again with anything, because it's just too convenient and it works too well when it works well. Um, I think we're in this situation where basically we are toddlers who got our hands on a chainsaw. You know, that's the metaphor I always use. Social media is like a tool, but it's not a screwdriver or a hammer. It's like a chainsaw, which means that it's on another level, right? And you have to know what you're doing if you want to get anything out of it. You have to know what you're doing. You have to be extremely disciplined. You have to be responsible. Read the instructions, put on your safety goggles, follow the protocol, and then you could do wonderful things, right? You can help build a house. You can do all kinds of stuff with a chainsaw. That's great. But if you don't know what you're doing, if you act like a moron, if you don't pay attention, uh, you can hack your leg off or someone else's leg off, right? So that the stakes are high in that way. And the only solution that I can see that is tenable is to train ourselves and help train each other how to be more responsible and how to be more disciplined. And what that means is recognizing that, for example, you don't get eye contact, you don't get body language, you don't get that real feel, there's a living, breathing person 2 feet away from me that I'm having this conversation with, which we've evolved to respond to and connect with, and is so much the basis of how we communicate with each other. We've eliminated that. That's all gone now in this space.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to actively and consciously make up the difference there. That's one thing that we just have to do. We have to constantly remind ourselves, this person, this entity on the other end of my invective is a human being. I'm sending this message to a human being, just like me, who gets their feelings hurt, who maybe misspoke, who is maybe misunderstanding you and you're misunderstanding them, who might be a 10-year-old. Like, you have no idea, right? So you have to consciously add those things into your own way of being on this thing, because no one's going to do it for you and no one can do it for you, right? It's not feasible to try and get somebody else to control this. We have to do it individually. We have to do it ourselves, the same way that it is your and my responsibility to be polite, right? To say, excuse me, to hold the door, to all those things, right? The same thing, like my responsibility to be a polite, decent human being, right? I want to make sure I don't stink so that I don't put people off. I want to make sure I'm dressed a certain way so that, I can work with people. I want to make sure that I communicate a certain way, right? At a job interview, at my job, in public, whatever. It's the same thing. It's just on a heightened level. So I feel like that's the only way we can do this, because there's no getting rid of it, and there's no kind of panopticon or benevolent dictatorship style way of controlling it. That's
It's true. It's a real challenge. There's an organization called the Conciliance Project. I'm not sure if you've heard of them, but they're
so,
putting out some really good, basically essays and articles taking a deep dive into some important topics. And one, they wrote a piece called like Why Technology is Not Values Neutral. And it's just sort of this really look at like how basically we're at the point where so much of our social media and technology is driven by artificial intelligence and algorithms.
Yeah.
That the way those are shaped really will have a huge impact on outcomes. So we almost, and like, the algorithms could be different. Like right now they're maximized to maximize engagement and maximize attention grabbing, because that's the financial incentive. Right. So I almost feel like there's a strong argument for we have to get to the point where we are consciously shaping our social media ecology with a different architecture so that the algorithms actually point toward helping people find different perspectives, right? Instead of the reality tunnel that will keep you engaged, actually helping you be exposed to other perspectives. Because right now there's so much on the individual where like I have to seek out different perspectives. I have to check in with the conservative media and the progressive media and really idiosyncratic thinkers out there in order to be well informed. And it's just such a big ask for people to do that.
It is a lot.
Hopefully that's a shift that we can make in the near future, because it's so needed. For folks who are interested, I would recommend checking out the Conciliance Project and their papers on that.
Yeah, no, I agree. Anything we can do to help is great.
Yeah.
I'm wary of any kind of hard control
Yeah.
in that way, because then
Yeah.
who gets to decide, and how do we
Yeah.
decide who gets to
It's a
decide?
slippery slope. I think part
But
of the realization is it's already happening. So we
mhm,
have to do our best and be transparent about it. Like we actually need more
yeah,
transparency and more openness about how the algorithms work, because
yeah,
it's impossible to
absolutely.
have a system that isn't shaped by algorithms.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
like you said, the algorithms, I've written about this. The algorithms are designed to get and keep your attention.
Hmm.
What specifically gets and keeps your attention is partly up to you, at least partly up
Hmm.
to you.
Hmm.
So my feed is very different from someone else's feed, because
Yeah.
I've actively curated it to be a certain way. And so
Yeah.
positive engagement, constructive engagement is what I see, because it's what I seek out.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
it can be done, but it is a lot. And it's hard for people to be, you know, someone who's not as obsessive about it as me, someone who's just trying to get their work done and, is not necessarily thinking about it in this way. It's going to be hard for them to have the discipline and self-awareness right at the outset.
Hmm.
It wouldn't even occur to them to need it, right? They're just like, oh, I'm just using this thing and I'm getting what I'm getting.
Hmm.
That's hard, and I get that. So anything we can do to help would be
Hmm.
great. So I'm not against
Yeah.
any of that stuff, you know.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a big piece of it. There's just there's so many sort of subtopics that I was thinking we could maybe explore. And right now I'm just not sure how to even get into them. Like some of the sort of popular confusions that I feel like are out there,
Uh-huh.
like we already sort of talked about. I feel like what we talked about in terms of race and racism sort of gets at the sort of confusion around colorblindness that's out there, where people sort of think
Yeah.
like we've
Yeah.
lost sight of the aspiration of
Mhm.
getting post-racial. So we're kind of doubling down on it. But I
Yeah.
feel like we already talked about that a little bit. And then there's also the
Mm.
tension out there around like equal outcomes, like systemic
Mm.
racism,
Yeah.
and how to understand what systemic racism is, and how
Mhm.
that's kind of getting conflated with equal outcomes in a way where it's like
Right.
whenever there aren't equal outcomes, that's evidence of systemic racism, which I think
Yeah.
is a really confused way of thinking, as opposed to looking at actual instances of systemic racism, like
Mhm.
redlining, or like
Yeah.
bias in jobs based on name,
Right.
or like just
Right.
having job networks that just inherently are based on personal context, which end up having racialized dynamics to them. Like those are maybe
Right.
examples of systemic racism. I'm wondering
Yeah.
if you've come across things like that, where
Mhm.
you're helping people to understand some of these distinctions and bring some conceptual clarity to some of those issues.
Yeah, I think a huge problem that we have is we begin to use things as proxies for other things, and then we forget that they're
Mm-hmm.
proxies. They
Mm-hmm.
become the thing itself.
Mm-hmm.
The same way that grades, for example, an A, you used to want to get an A because it symbolized that you have achieved a certain level of knowledge, right? A certain understanding of the material. The A was meant to signify, oh, this person really understands the material. The person who got the B understands the material very well, but not as well as this guy. And then it became a thing of, okay, well, I really want to get the A. So what do I got to do to get the A? And it's not necessarily having a full grasp of the material. It becomes, oh, if I figure out what the questions are on the test, if I that kind of thing. And so you can get an A and walk out of that class with no grasp of the material,
Mm-hmm.
because now the thing that was meant to be a proxy is now the thing itself, and it's the only thing that matters. We've incentivized it because the bureaucratic nature of our systems becomes a thing of like, oh, this person got straight A's, great, let them in, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't necessarily indicate anything anymore, because of the way that it's a natural thing. I don't know if there's any real escape, but being mindful
Yeah.
of it is important, right? So the thing about systemic racism, or the thing about unequal outcomes, I think, is poisoned fundamentally from the outset, right? Because you're measuring based on these categories to begin with. And so that's the first mistake, because people don't fit into these categories that way. And the assumptions you're making about those categories after the fact make it even harder to actually pinpoint what an issue might be, if there is one, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the example I always use is, imagine right now we just pause the world and we subdivided everyone into groups based on what top they're wearing, right? So t-shirts, tank tops, no shirt, dresses, button downs, right? Those are the categories. And then we started the world back up and we just started pulling in data and we go, oh, look, tank tops are only 2% of the population when it comes to this particular metric, or button downs score higher on this test than dresses do. It must be some kind of, any assumption you make based on that, any assumption, whether it's, oh, there's something biologically superior about button downs, or there must be some systematic thing occurring that is keeping dresses from scoring as well as button downs. Both of those assumptions are ridiculous because they're based on these categories that make no sense in the first place. Like, we just made those categories up. They have no bearing on anything, and they obscure all the actual detail and variables that are at play that you're not looking at. So that's one of the issues there. And I just think it's the wrong way to approach it. If we care about poverty, for example, if we care about people who are living in poverty, just care about people who live in poverty. I don't care what their skin color is. I don't care what's between their legs. I don't care about any of that. I care about the fact that they're poor and they're struggling, right? If there's a school that is not getting proper funding, and as a result, their students are not getting properly educated, I care about that. I don't care what color they are. I don't care what their background is. I don't care if their ancestors were slaves or not. It's irrelevant to this problem. I care in the sense that, that's terrible, but I don't care in the sense of fixing this particular issue because it's irrelevant. I care about funding that school and making sure those kids get educations because they deserve it, because they're human beings. So a lot of just the way that we're looking at these things causes the problem. And I think even the colorblindness issue is another one. There are two problems with it, in my view. One is a kind of, whether it's intentional or not, a misunderstanding of the metaphor, right? Oh, you want a colorblind society, which means you want to pretend racism doesn't exist. No, like, that's not what Martin Luther King meant. He knew exactly what he meant, and I think everyone knew exactly what he meant. And I think that it's a kind of cynical way of addressing it, to say, oh, you just want to pretend race doesn't exist, like that meme of like, oh, I don't see color, I didn't even realize you were black. The whole point was that it's irrelevant to my judgment of you, right? I see the differences between us, but, or in the colorblind thing is, yes, I see that I'm a different race than you, but it's irrelevant to my moral or any other kind of judgment of you, right? That was the goal. That is the ideal to aspire towards. And I actually think the second problem is that there was something fundamentally wrong with that anyway, but it's not the thing that people say. The thing that's fundamentally wrong with it is the acceptance of race is baked into it. It's like, I accept race and I see it, but it's irrelevant to me morally. But we shouldn't accept race. We shouldn't accept it at all. And that's the step forward beyond colorblindness that we should be getting to, right? We can't get to a post-racial society if we are accepting race and then just trying very hard not to let it affect us. We have to get to a post-racial society by rejecting race, right?
And the move there, that's not rejecting that obviously we see differences in melanin skin, nor do we not see culture or ethnicity. We just the notion of a proxy there is really important. It's a really important general point that basically, I feel like race is often conflated with or used as a proxy for privilege. People talk about white privilege. People are concerned about privilege because they're concerned about justice and equity and fairness and meritocracy. And it's almost like we have to find just more reasonable and simple ways to include the merits and the important things about notions like meritocracy and justice and fairness, and just be more specific on those things. Like you said, there are certain contexts within which things may or may not be fair, and we need to look at that. But that's not, there's a real difference between sort of focusing on meritocracy and trying to improve fairness and equality and equity, but then controlling outcomes. Like, there's just such a huge gap there And if we
Mhm.
don't use race as a proxy for privilege, but we just focus on privilege in different contexts, I think
Mhm.
we'll get a lot further. And actually, a book that I read called Deep Diversity, which you may have heard from, he talks about the
Mm.
difference between global social power and local social power. And just because we so often think in these really broad global terms, like white people have more power than people of
Yeah,
color. And it's just like there are many contexts in which that's not necessarily true. You just have to
many.
be more context specific. So you can
Right.
step back and you can say globally, historically, there is some truth to those things. But in any particular lived, embodied context, it's much more complicated. And sometimes it's inverted. And that's
Right.
just a reality of social dynamics.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, I grew up with immigrant parents. They worked super hard, right? But I didn't struggle through poverty. Uh, I never wanted for anything. You know, they did when they
Yeah.
were younger,
Yeah.
but they moved here and they did what they had to do. And by the time I had memories, I couldn't imagine. I couldn't think of anything that was a real struggle. Of course I would complain about this or that, or they would say, no, we're not going to get you that thing. It's too expensive or whatever. But it
Mhm.
wasn't this thing where I didn't know if I was going to eat that day, or we worried about having shelter, right? Or we worried about having clothes for school or nothing like that,
Mhm.
nothing like that.
Mhm.
But you might assume that about me, and that's
Mhm.
understandable, but it's an improper rubric to use, right? So as you mentioned, historically speaking, generally speaking, you can say certain things, but that's the point about generalities, right? That's the point of averages. Like, the averages don't necessarily indicate how you should behave with an individual. You're going to have to figure it out as you meet people and just say, okay, what's your particular circumstance? Because there are way too many variables. 200 years ago, yes, if you noticed a highly melanated person, you could bet $1 million and probably win all day that this person was poor, not educated because they had no access to it, all those things. But we don't live in that context anymore. Things have changed quite drastically. And one of the things that I think is such an issue is the seemingly fervent desire to not acknowledge progress.
Mhm.
It and the conflation of acknowledging progress with pretending everything is perfect.
Yeah.
That's silly. No one is saying everything is perfect, but
Yeah.
some things are far better than they used to be, and that's great.
Yeah.
That's a reason to keep going.
Mhm.
Um, and I just think it's important for us to recognize that these rubrics that we use don't apply all the time,
Mhm.
and that the assumptions we make about individual human beings ends up being not just hurtful to them, harmful to them individually, but it also makes it so that we can't fix the real problems that we have. Just as you
Yeah.
mentioned, if we're looking at the end of the pipeline and we're going, oh, look, the outcomes are unequal based on race, besides the category errors that I mentioned, it's
Mhm.
also just you're doing the proxy thing again.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
it's just, and you're necessarily reducing these people to one variable or another. What if we mentioned cultures, and it's a dirty word in so many ways, but there are different cultures, and cultures are just ways of being in the world, strategies for flourishing. That's another way of looking at what a culture is.
Mhm.
And we have different ones, and there could be historical reasons why we have different ones, right? And we can try to affect those. We can say, hey, look, this particular strategy is not helpful to you because these are the outcomes, right? And it doesn't matter, you don't have to kind of essentialize culture either, right?
Mhm.
Because just like in your experience, you were
Mhm.
technically in a culture to which you didn't belong,
Mhm.
and you can see how silly that is. It's your culture. You grew up there. That's your who you are.
Mhm.
Um, so we don't have to essentialize culture, but we just have to say, look, this particular practice is probably not going to lead to good benefits. You should probably try a different one, or statistics show that this is a better one or not. People take that personally. They take that as a kind of judgment, some essentialist sort of judgment. But
Mhm.
really, it's just, hey, man, like, you know, if you if one person gets on a treadmill every day for 30 minutes and the other person doesn't, that's going to be, there's going to be differences there. There's going to be a difference in outcomes, right? And you have to take that into account when you're going to the end of the pipeline and just saying, oh, these two people have different outcomes. It must be because of one variable, you know?
Yeah.
And it's more complicated.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, closing in on some final thoughts, I guess, just to respect our time. Yeah, it's just interesting. It's complex. I feel like a lot of our conversation has just, it's been an unpacking and a nuancing. And there's a way in which, one of the things I'm often stuck by is there's a way in which there's almost a developmental requirement. Like we have to develop and evolve our thinking, and the way that we can hold both and perspectives. Like there's almost just a certain capacity we have to inculcate in everyone through education or through our culture to help people with these kinds of both and thinking. Like, yes, we can acknowledge racism and we can understand the sort of the construction or unreality of race, and we can understand the sort of difference between race and privilege, right? And we can understand like the way in which white privilege is a thing and the context in which it's not a thing. Like all these things are true. It's really just like, how do we integrate more and more and more truths and get more and more subtle in our thinking? So, you know, I guess as an educator, I'm just left with, okay, like we have this journey of like deepened thinking and understanding we need to bring people on. But then also at the same time, there's a way in which it just seems very simple and very intuitive. And I think young children actually, you know, get some of these basic things in really simple ways. And we just confuse people with these proxies and these abstractions and these categories and these concepts. And it's almost like, you know, on one hand, it seems really complex and it's almost like asking too much of people. Like we have a scaling problem. Like, how do we ask a world of 8 billion people to all have really sophisticated both and complex thinking? And on the other hand, it's like, wait a minute. No, like I've worked with young kids and they basically get it. It's just such a paradox for me. I don't know if you have any reflections.
No, it's you're so right. And I think that the reason why the complexity becomes unbearable and we are worried about scaling it is because the complexity itself is unnecessary. And that's what you're talking about. You know, like there's this great video that was going around, I think last summer or maybe before that, but that's when I saw it. These two kids in kindergarten, probably. One is racialized white, the other one racialized black, but they're best friends and they say we're twins. We have the same eyebrows. You know, so, you know, like they didn't need to be told anything. They recognized one another in one another. And all that's going to happen to them, unfortunately, very likely, is in the next 10, 15 years, that's going to get beaten out of them. And they're going to be told, no, there's something fundamentally different about you two that you can never reconcile, ever. It's impossible because we live in this world where blah, 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 blah. You know, we're corrupting this beautiful thing. There's excuse me, there's this book called Racecraft.
Yeah, I've read it.
Okay. So by Barbara and Karen Fields, and there's an anecdote within it. I forget exactly what the details were, but there's an anecdote about this little kid comes home from school, says hi to his mom and his mom's friend who's over, and you know, is talking about a friend of theirs from school, like, oh, my friend Timmy, whatever, blah blah blah, and just happens to mention, oh, my friend Timmy is Peach, right? And the parents kind of laugh, like, oh, isn't it cute? He doesn't know yet, right? And the thing is, the kid knows more than they do, because what the kid is doing is going, oh, I see people categorizing one another through color, but there's a complexity. So I'm going to have to deal with the complexity. I can't just say that kid's white because that's not the color crayon. The color crayon that this kid looks most like is peach. And the color crayon that I look most like is terracotta. And, you know, they're going to get into the diversity and complexity in a way, in this beautiful, innocent way, because they recognize that those categories don't work.
Yeah.
You know, and that's the thing. We just need to preserve that, first of all, and then figure out a way to get the grownups to stop, because it's unnecessary. You know, let's talk about culture. Let's talk about ethnicity. Let's talk about community. Let's talk about history. Let's talk about all those things. It's beautiful, but we don't have to keep doing this to ourselves. We don't have to keep forcing ourselves into these boxes. And I feel like we can feel that our clothes don't fit right. You
Yeah,
know, we're trying so hard to make it work and it
yeah,
doesn't, you
yeah.
know? Uh,
Yeah, no, it's so, and then I just last two thoughts I want to share. Just two
no,
things
please.
come to
Yeah.
mind. One is that there's a woman named Benita Roy who I've gotten to know a little bit. She's a really interesting
Mm,
thinker, and she has this notion that she calls releasing complexity, and she's sort of like reflecting on.
yeah.
There's this sort of hyper complexity, and it feels like our social world is just getting more and more complex. Our technological world is getting more and more complex. And it's
Mhm,
almost like we can't just keep getting more and more complex. We actually have to find a way to release
mhm.
complexity and come back to a sort of second simplicity, like the
Yeah,
simplicity on the other side of complexity. And
right.
I feel like as a species, in a way, we're sort of on this journey of like getting more and more complex and reaching this sort of crescendo of some sense of like a meta crisis. And our sense of identity and selfhood is all wrapped up into that. But somehow on the other side
Yeah,
of it, there needs to be this really simple release where we can actually just like be together in this wholesome
yeah. I keep thinking of, I love IT guys and programmers. I'm
way.
not one of them, but I
Mm,
love those guys because for some reason, I just understand their predicament,
mm,
because they're getting all these requests and all these problems that they need to figure out how to solve in a system that's still running and is responsible for the whole infrastructure of a company or whatever, right?
mm,
It's the whole database, it's the whole email list, it's the whole accounts receivable, it's everything. And they have to figure out how to navigate all these new things people want and all these current things that aren't working properly.
mhm,
And what happens is they build code on top of code and then code on top of that code and then code on top of
mhm,
that code to fix the problem from the previous two codes.
mhm,
And then you go back and you look at all the code and you're like, what is this? Right.
mhm,
And that's kind of where we're at.
mhm,
And in many ways, it would be great to just kind of pause, erase everything, and rebuild based on what we know we need. And then
mhm.
you can have one simple code, right?
Yeah,
I'm oversimplifying the hell out of the situation, but
yeah,
metaphorically, you get where I'm coming from. You
yeah.
know, I think that you're right about the simplicity. The answer is simple. It might be difficult, but the answer I think is simple, which
Yeah.
is that there are two things that are simultaneously true, even though they may seem to be in conflict with one another. The one
Mhm,
thing is that we are all more alike than we are different. We are fundamentally united by our common humanity and our common just wiring as human beings. We all want fundamentally the same things. We want to be safe, we want to be secure, we want to be successful, we want satisfaction out of life. Those are all the things that we want. How those desires manifest themselves varies wildly because the world is big and the details are all over the place, right?
mhm,
But it's still true that anything that people do, anything that people want, anything that people talk about in some way reduces to one of those core components because we're all wired the same. We're human beings,
mhm,
right? We share 99% of our DNA. It's not it's not that complicated in that way, right? So
mhm,
that's the one thing. But then at the other end of that is that each and every one of us is a singular human being, unique, and even twins are not exactly alike,
mhm,
and that's a beautiful thing too, and that there is a crazy amount of complexity even in that 1%. there's so
mhm,
much there's so much diversity, and there's so much,
mhm,
but just amazing, just the scope of what we're capable of doing and being, right?
mhm,
And some of it's great and some of it's terrible and some of it is both. But both those things are true, and keeping those two things in mind at all times can help
mhm.
simplify what our problems are.
Yeah.
What do we want? We want to stop
Mhm,
people from suffering. We want to keep suffering to a minimum, right? At the very least. There are ways to do that. That's a concrete goal, and you can apply it in a very simple way. We don't have to worry so much about, oh, but this kid's white and this kid's black and it's different. No, it's not. They're both human beings. Are they
mhm,
suffering? What is the problem we're trying to solve here? How is it applying to this person versus this person? And then you find the way to mitigate it the best you can, you know
mhm,
and
mhm.
we just have these strategies that end up dividing and making things much more complicated. But we
Yeah.
don't have to. We don't have to at all.
Yeah, brother. I hear you. I agree. And there's a way in which these simple truths and these universal truths have an almost spiritual quality to
They
them.
do.
You know? And I'm optimistic in the sense that the teachers and teachings that we've had cross-culturally for millennia, and the people that we can see as holders of wisdom, the elders, the actual teachers, the actual leaders, they've all been saying variations of the same thing for a
Yeah.
really long time in different languages and different contexts. And those things are going to stay true. And that's
Yeah,
the
man.
simplicity on the other side. Like those things are going
Yeah,
to be true 100 years from now, just like they were true a few
for
hundred years ago.
sure. But man, we have this stubborn just insistence. No, it's more complicated.
No, it's like I feel like, we're in a sort of adolescent phase or something as our
We are.
culture, our species. But there is a longer arc. I believe there is this longer arc of growth and development that we're on
I agree.
as a collective and as individuals. So
I agree, man.
thank you. And thank you for sharing your words of wisdom and your story with
Oh,
me. And I'm hoping that this can be helpful to others.
thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much. It was awesome to talk to you. And I hope it's helpful. I hope it's instructive or constructive for people. That's
Yeah,
all I'm
I
trying to
think
do
at the
here.
least it'll probably bring up questions and maybe lead to more good conversations.
Yeah, please have them. And
Yeah.
come find me and talk to me. Ask me questions. I don't want to be wrong for a second longer than I need to. So
Yeah.
please.
Yeah, and just shout out that your work with FAIR is definitely worth checking out for people who aren't familiar.
Yeah.
I do recommend it. I've been impressed and inspired by the things that you guys are trying to do.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Yeah. Fairforall.org is where you could find us. And angeleduardo.com is where you could find me.
Cool. Thanks, Angel.
Thank you, man.